Hi, this is Anita Engels, Dispute Resolution Specialist for Cadre. Welcome to today's webinar, Mediating in the Context of Broken Trust. We're delighted you can join us today. This webinar continues a series that began in 2010 and is being presented today by Kathy Fromey and Greg Abel. Phone lines have been muted to minimize interruptions. You can enter any question or comment into the questions box on your screen, not the chat box on your control panel. The PowerPoint for this webinar is also available in the handouts box on your control panel and on the Cadre website. We're extremely fortunate to have Kathy and Greg with us today. Dr. Kathy Fromey began her journey as an educator 35 years ago as a first grade teacher in California, and has held district, regional, and state development department positions in Washington, Oregon, and California. Kathy developed Washington's statewide special education mediation system and was also the diversity manager for Washington State Department of Natural Resources. Kathy's current work with the Washington State Charter School Commission focuses on the Commission's charter school authorizing activities. Kathy has consulted, written, and presented extensively in the areas of workforce diversity, trust, relationship building, and transition and the change process, designing and implementing strategies for employee workforce diversity and conflict engagement. She holds a BS in kinesiology and education from UCLA, an MS from San Jose State University, and a doctorate in educational leadership and policy studies from the University of Washington. Greg Abel is the principal at Sound Options Group, LLC, a conflict engagement firm and national consultant in the design and delivery of conflict engagement resources. He spent 15 years in public education as a school psychologist and special services administrator. Since 1994, Sound Options has provided special education mediation services for the state of Washington. Greg works primarily in the context of education and social services systems, and his particular expertise is in designing and implementing systems for more effectively engaging conflict and facilitating productive and collaborative work environments. As a professional mediator, he has 25+ years experience mediating highly contentious multi-party, community, and institutional disputes. Greg weaves this experience into his consulting and teaching as he assists individuals and organizations to collaboratively navigate conflict and change. That was a lot, but you can read more about Greg and Kathy on the Cadre website. And remember, if you want to access the PowerPoint for this webinar, it's available in the handouts box on your control panel and on the Cadre website. The webinar will also be recorded and posted on the website. Now to the topic of today's webinar. Trust is a complex notion. In this webinar, Kathy and Greg will help us think about our experiences and beliefs about trust, identify strategies for negotiating trust, and for reaching agreements on actions people can take that might rebuild trust. This sounds like a fascinating and challenging endeavor, so let's get started. Greg?
Thank you, Anita. I appreciate the introduction. So again, this is Greg Abel. I'm here with Kathy Fromey, coming to you from Bainbridge Island, Washington, so welcoming you either good morning or good afternoon, depending on the context. Real quickly, Kathy and I actually started working together back in 1994 when she was working for the State Department, and we contracted with them to design our state's special ed mediation system. So we've had a long history of working together in that context. Probably started working together 10+ years ago in sharing the work that Kathy was doing with trust and integrating it with the work that I do in conflict. And so this is actually an opportunity for us to share probably a culmination of a 10-year conversation around this particular topic. We've got a lot to cover, and so let me just quickly go over the objectives of what we want to cover during our time together. Kathy's going to start by really giving us a structure, a paradigm for understanding this notion of trust. As mediators, we often find ourselves in a conversation where there has been broken trust. I don't trust you, you don't trust me, trust does not exist. And we often get stymied because where do you go from there? And what we found is that we often don't even have the language that's sufficient to engage the conversation and unpack what is a complex notion. So Kathy is going to introduce a typology of trust, which comes from her doctoral dissertation work, which actually begins to give us language to understand in a more nuanced way what we're talking about when we're talking about trust. We're then going to move to looking at, we can talk about types of trust, what manifests trust, and we're going to look at 6 attributes, which are really behavioral, measurable attributes that indicate the presence and or absence of trust, and again, gives us a way of engaging a conversation as to what's missing that creates a context of lack of trust. What do we need to build in as far as assets and or attributes? We've used both those terms to begin to engage trust effectively. And then the final conversation really is, where does this happen? It happens in the context of a conversation. As mediators, what do? We facilitate conversations. And so I want to end the presentation by looking at structures that we as mediators can facilitate conversations specifically around this topic of trust, questions that we get asked, looking at, in many cases, a more narrative approach, which we'll get to in a moment. So we're going to kick off with Kathy diving in here and really introducing you to her research around trust and the typology.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Anita. Good to be on with all of you today and to share this information. I'm going to start with a little bit about social capital before we dive into trust. And some of you may have been on a webinar that I did with Cadre years ago. So I'm going to quickly go through that webinar, but just know that in the interest of time, we really want to get to attributes and that third objective, the entry points for creating a new narrative. And so today's goal is really to give you some tools, a variety of tools in the form of inquiry and questions and the demonstrable attributes that will allow you to engage in some new entry points in rebuilding trust. So let's just quickly, and again, I apologize for going through this breakneck speed, but we really want to get to some other things, and we'd be happy to share more information on the trust types and the typology to anyone who might be interested in further information. But basically, this whole notion around trust is centered all around a concept called social capital that most of you already know about. And social capital really is the motivations and the inclinations for people to do things for each other. That comes through loud and clear as a necessity in any kind of mediation. What are my motivations or my inclinations to bring a resolution or come to some kind of win-win in a mediation? So what we talk about when we talk about trust, we talk about social capital and social networks and who people know and how we trust each other. But more importantly, what social capital gives us is it gives us these norms or these behaviors for reciprocity. And reciprocity not in the form of I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, which often is the case when you have conflict. I'll only give you information if you give me information, and you can see this play out in any number of situations, whether it's on a national level or I'm sure someplace in your work situation, tit for tat reciprocity. True social capital and trust comes from what we call unbalanced reciprocity, where I'll do for you in the unknown event that sometime in the future you'll do for me if I need that. It's a situation of interdependent action for mutual benefit. And you can actually see that played out very well in the unfortunate instance of these last 2 hurricanes, Harvey and Irma, where people are helping each other just because it helps us all when we're all healthy and well and safe and in a good space. So this whole notion of social capital is essential to collective problem solving, whether that's with 2 parties in a mediator or 30 parties in a mediation and a mediator. What we're looking for is collective problem solving. And Greg and I, in our individual work, have engaged in this 10, 12-year conversation about how what happens in mediation and conflict resolution is intricately tied to what we know about trust. So let's go down that pike and talk a little bit about that. What we know for sure is that there's a strong correlation between the quality of the relationships between adults in the system and the outcomes of the system. This is critically important to the work we do in education and specifically special education. So thus comes the trust typology, and some of you have seen this before. I'm going to just give you the 4 big types right now in the interest of moving on to the attributes, because this is where this mapping out of trust is where we often see the breakdown in conflict and some of the rationale and reasons behind conflict. Not always, but often. So let's start with this notion of particularized trust. Before I do that, though, all of these types of trust are critical to any interaction or any entity or any organization. One is not more important than another. One doesn't take priority over another. They all overlap in this Venn diagram because they are all critically important. And that critical overlap space in the middle is where we have strong social capital and strong trust. But let's go through these types, and then we'll get to the manifestations or the actionable behaviors that demonstrate trustworthiness. There are, in the research, generally 4 types of trust. There are a couple of subtypes, and they go by different names, but for the typology, I've chosen these names. And the first type of trust is this trust. It's called particularized trust, and it really just is a trust about, it's about solidarity. It's, I trust you because you look like me, you dress like me, you believe the same things I believe in, and you behave like me. It's us against them. Typically, you see a particularized trust. You can see it manifested in religious groups, gangs, the mafia is another good example, ethnic groups, where people, again, you look like me, you dress like me, you believe the same things I believe in. And particularized trust is so important to an organization or to a group of people or to a team because it represents belonging and solidarity. Out of all of the trust types, though, particularized trust has a very dark side that I call the dark side. It also manifests itself in what we oftentimes call cliques and isolation. Strong particularized trust groups only allow their members to learn and gain from people in their group. Again, it's an us versus them. Don't talk to them. They don't know anything. And they have very obligatory behaviors. They have an authoritarian who tells folks what to do. So there's the very plus side, this solidarity belongingness notion, and then there's this dark side, the clique side, that we could talk more about at another time. What happens in particularized trust is that there are social sanctions for misbehavior or breaching trust. Social sanctions in the terms of I'll ostracize you, kick you out of the group, I can kill you if I'm in the mafia, I could beat you up if you're in my gang and you break trust. So there are social sanctions to breaking trust when we talk about particularized trust. If you jump over to the other circle across the way, there institutional and system trust. That's a kind of trust that is based on conditions that larger groups of people must rely on. So conditions such as rules, laws, regulations, certification, licensures, anything that says these systems or conditions are in place, legal, most times, legal systems, are in place to ensure that you can trust what I'm going to do, the contract I'm going to give you is going to work. And in an institutional system trust, people trust because of those rules and regulations and systems. In the world of education, specifically special education, we have a number of rules and regulations that tell schools and districts these are the appropriate ways to ensure and hold you accountable to make sure that students are receiving services. And it also tells parents these are in place to make sure your child gets the services that your child is entitled to. So institutional system trust is a trust that says, when I believe that all these conditions are properly working, then I'll trust the system. Again, we're having lots of breakdowns in our institutional systems these days, and so we get what happens when you break trust in an institutional system. Unlike particularized trust, where there are social sanctions, in institutional system trust, there are legal sanctions. So if I break my if you break your contract with me, I can sue you, or you could sue me. So the sanctions are much stronger, much more accountable when they're in place. As of late, I find that there is a breakdown in the accountability for institutional system trust, which is making it even more hard for people to trust in institutions. Used to be in a day and time where you would just trust that when the institution or your government said this is what's happening, it was happening. So
I could just weigh in here. I think institutional trust is, again, where we're seeing we spend a tremendous amount of time drafting an IEP, a document which is a contract, which is legal, which articulates what we've agreed to and committed to. I think where we're seeing conflicts, and I'm sure this is true for many of you, is that there's a breakdown in the implementation of that institutional, which then has people questioning, can I trust the institution? Because even though we've reached this document, we've reached this articulation of what we've agreed to, implementation is not meeting my expectations. And so is that because we haven't done sufficient clarity in articulating what those expectations are? I think we do see, again, our focus on compliance, I think, is in many ways an attempt to build institutional systems trust.
yes, but you can't just have institutional system trust.
No.
Again, you need all of these trust types.
Absolutely.
So the third trust type is a generalized social trust, and that's just a trust in most people for the public good. People trust in a generalized way, and you have voluntary associations with other people. It's a general sense of trust in another person or another entity or others. Very different, and partly very different than particularized trust, but some of the same aspects. The difference between generalized and particularized is particularized trust only those in their own particularized group. Generalized trust say you trust beyond your particularized group. So it's a trust in other members of your group or outside of your group, and it's generalized across all members in society. It's not tied to reputation of individuals, but it's more, as I spoke earlier, this balanced reciprocity. It's a simultaneous, if you will, an equal exchange between individuals, and it's more of a continuous relationship. And it can be as simple as myself trusting my neighborhood kid to water the lawn and feed the cats when I'm away, and giving them my house key to trusting your the education system or your government or your banking system. So it's a generalized trust, which really is, it's a rational gamble for most people. And most of us take that generalized social gamble. We trust others because we trust the systems, and in some cases because we trust our particularized groups. I know I'm running through these, but we want to get to the other matters at hand here. These next three kind of trusts are really based on have a moral component, which is why they're grouped together. Equally important to the work we do in education, though, and society at large. There's this notion of fiduciary trust, which is really based on a moral obligation to those of us who have more power and more resources to care for those in our stead. So a board member would have more power and resources and has a moral obligation to care for the staff and students in their school district. A parent or a teacher has more power and more resources and has a moral obligation, a sacred trust, some people call this, to care for those in their stead. A parent to care for their children and to have their best interest at heart. A teacher to care for the students in their classroom and have their best interest at heart. Again, there are serious breaches of fiduciary trust in our world today. I won't even go into the long, long list of those, but it's the difference. This in all of the work that I do, in all of the years that I've worked around trust and relationship building in groups, is the one type of trust that almost to a T, every group will say we need to work harder in this area. And all you have to do is read the newspaper to know that to be the case. And it's again, the most sacred of trusts because it's a moral obligation to care for those who cannot care for themselves or don't have the same power and resources to do so. Very different is altruistic trust, which is not a moral obligation. Altruistic trust is a gift. It's from altruism. It's a gift I give you. It's got a moral component to it, and then I give you that gift, and this is an important trust for conflict, and one that I myself have not had to struggle with. So I know what I'm saying here when I tell people what it's about. Altruistic trust is a gift for the good of the whole. I will trust you when I have no absolute reason to trust you at all. No track record, no reason. In fact, I have every reason not to trust you based on experience and behavior, but I will trust you for the gift of the good. And that is a very hard trust these days for us to get past, though one that's very important. So we want to get to the attributes in a minute because we think we have stumbled on in our research and in our work some wonderful behaviors and ways that we can be demonstrative about these types of trust to change the narrative around broken trust. And lastly, dispositional trust is really a person's disposition to trust or not to trust. It's a consistent tendency over time that individuals have for a variety of reasons to be a trusting person or to not trust. And this kind of breaks down into two different kinds of trust, two different types of people, I guess, if you will, or responses to trust. In dispositional trust, some people generally trust because they have a belief that people are generally trustworthy. So if you have a strong disposition to trust, you walk in the world with this belief that most people are good and they're trustworthy, so I'm always going to trust them, unless there's a reason not to, a big reason not to. Another way of looking at trust is that there are some people with less of a disposition to trust, but will still trust, irregardless of whether people are good or bad. They believe that they'll obtain better outcomes by trusting, and so they trust. So we have in this moral component, all of these three are, I believe, critical to the work that we do in education and especially mediation and special ed, because there are obligatory kinds of trust that we must pay attention to. There are gifts of trust that make a huge difference in the lives of kids, and there is this generic disposition of trust, which is the stronger your disposition of trust, the more open you are to the options that are presented to you. So that's very quickly the typology. We're going to now talk a little bit about trust in general, and this is where that typology starts to become action-oriented, and then we start to get into the attributes. Here's the thing to remember about trust. It's highly contextual. It's very situational. It depends on the people, the context, the situation. It has many elements. It's a multifaceted construct, and it can change over time in a snap, in a conversation, in an action, and in a behavior. It's very dynamic. So I always say you can, as if you were gambling, you can lose all of your chips in one hand. But really, when you get down to trust, it's relationship-based. You have to have at least one other party to have a trusting relationship. Oftentimes, it's more than one. And the bottom line, the research will tell us, is that trust is based on one's expectations or beliefs that the other party or the other person is going to act in a specific way. Now, the way I look at this is I have expectations and belief about how Greg will do his part in this webinar, and I think we're aligned to that, and I believe we're aligned to that. But what happens in most cases is people have different expectations. And so if Greg doesn't perform the way we said we're going, or I don't perform the way Greg is expecting me to perform, then that begins to erode trust. It's not the only reason, but it begins to erode trust. The other things that add upon that is that we oftentimes, and we need to in places of work and in the work that we do, have mutual understandings about our own roles and expectations. So again, and obligations. If I'm expecting Greg to behave in a certain way, and if I believe he has certain obligations to the work that we're doing together, and that he has a certain role, and his definition of those obligations and roles are different than mine, until we've had a conversation, every time he doesn't meet those obligations, in my mind's eye, we start to erode trust. And so it's really about the expectations and the obligations that we hold the other party to. And most times we find that the other party has a different understanding of those expectations, obligations, and roles.
Well, I think that what resonates for us as mediators is that for many of us as mediators, we often can go down to, so what's at the heart of so many of the conflicts we experience? It's an unclear or an unmet expectation. And I entered the relationship assuming that you operated with the same expectations that I am. And again, the word assumptions. We often don't clarify those. You violate that expectation, then my obvious interpretation is, well, there's something fundamentally wrong with you. We commit that fundamental attribution error. And that then becomes the seed, which we'll come back to, of the story. Well, then are you a trustworthy person? And so again, this idea of trust and expectations and conflict becomes so woven together, because if we get to the point where we determine at some point you're an untrustworthy person, one of the reasons we wanted to do this webinar is we often get stuck because we go, well, then what do we do? Right. And we don't even have the language to talk about, well, where was trust broken? How was trust broken? What does that look like? Where does trust exist? And so that correlation, that connection between expectations, unmet expectations, conflict, and trust are tightly woven together here.
And so what we often experience is that we get called in, and we get called in for any number of reasons to assist or facilitate conversations in a group, and really it comes down to broken trust. And what we know about broken trust is that by the time we get called in, it's already taken over. Broken trust is difficult to know if, in fact, over time, there really was a factual reason for that broken trust to happen. But here's what happened. Distrust has the capacity to be self-fulfilling. It justifies itself. And so it often is based on people's, by the time we get in, emotions or generalized responses to past interactions. And so there may be past interactions that individuals have encountered that they bring to current interactions, and something reminds them of that. Then there's a, excuse me, a belief that an expectation or an obligation was broken or violated, and then that person begins to distrust. And then the story just keeps building on itself, and the distrust just continues to build. So what we find in the work that we've been engaged in as of late is that broken trust needs a new narrative. We need to clarify the narrative or recreate a new narrative. And we believe that that can happen through conversation. Conversation is a relationship. And we know that trust is very embedded in relationships, and the reference to those relationships, whether equal reference, whether there's a power structure in those reference or a fiduciary obligation in those reference, does make a difference in terms of how people respond to that conversation. So what we've done in our work is that we've taken what I had identified years ago as demonstrable, actionable, observable behaviors of trustworthy behavior. And we've done further research and incorporated what we know from the work that we do. And we have what we call our 6 attributes. Greg and I call them 6 attributes of our better selves. And we're going to take all of these but give you just 1 or 2 examples for each as we go through. And we believe that these are entry points to begin a new narrative and to reconstruct where trust has broken down and where we might begin to rebuild. A few slides ago, when I was talking about what trust is under expectations and obligations, the very last bullet was trust requires risk and vulnerability. And so when you have broken trust, you have people who feel violated, who feel that they are not understood, that expectations and obligations have been broken, and we believe that these actionable behaviors begin to demonstrate. So here's the part. These are very important words. Demonstrable behavior, demonstrations of trustworthiness. We can't just, so we're gonna talk about these, but you can't just say, I'm honest and I have integrity and I'm benevolent and caring. In order to rebuild trust, you have to demonstrate that behavior on a pretty consistent daily basis, or whatever your interaction allows you to, your interactions allow you to connect with the other party. So let's start with benevolence and caring. So there are more examples, but we are just taking a few here. And so in terms of mediation and entry points, we want to talk about what does demonstrable action look like. And so if you think about a mediation situation, you have 2 parties or a number of parties and typically a mediator or sometimes even 2 mediators. What's important to demonstrate in these actual situations, if you want to start to even consider to recreate the narrative, is demonstrably demonstrating with behavior your extension of goodwill, your positive intentions, and that you are going to hold confidential what's in that mediation, and mostly that you're putting another person's well-being in front of yours. So again, you have individuals who are going into a mediation who are risking a lot, feeling very vulnerable, and not having any reason to trust. So this is a good example of where altruistic trust comes into place. And again, I don't think Greg and I would propose anything that we haven't already ourselves struggled with. These are what look like to be very easy things to do, and they're very difficult in the context of broken trust. So what does extending goodwill look like in a mediation?
Well, I think in mediation, a classic commitment in mediation is I'm committed to mutual purpose, which means when I enter into mediation, particularly in mediation in the way that we practice it in special education, is that I'm committed to achieving my objectives, and I'm equally committed to helping you achieve your objectives. And so I'm putting energy, I'm committing, I'm caring about your needs in this situation, and I'm committed to, if we're going to achieve mutual purpose or mutual benefit, integrate my thinking and my energy into this shared, our sharing our ability to meet our objectives around whatever the issue is. Yeah, okay.
So another attribute would be honesty and integrity. And again, I know these are words that we toss around all the time and we hear them, but demonstrable honesty and integrity is what it looks like, and what I can see when I'm with people who have honesty and integrity is that they walk their talk. They tell the truth and they keep their word. And we know that in mediation, being authentic and being real, also keeping promises to resolutions and honoring agreements. So in terms of mediation and mediators, not only these are behaviors that we look to find and look to see that they're happening, but they're a clue and they're a flag for mediator if you're seeing that they're not being demonstrated. For you as a mediator, those are opportunities for you to then go in and assist, because you're not going to recreate a narrative unless you've helped individuals begin with honesty and integrity or benevolence and caring. So if you see that necessarily, or get the notion that you're back in a second mediation because someone hadn't honored the original agreement, that could be an entry point.
I think the other thing to look at, each of these attributes have applications in an individual and a collective context. So we often talk about honesty and integrity. Is that person an honest person? Does that person have integrity? We often deal with a lot of disputes where, again, the system is not being honest. The system is not operating with integrity. The system is making commitments. It is not following through on those commitments. The system is not demonstrating care and compassion for me, for my family, for the needs that I have, or that individual. So again, as we're looking at these attributes, I want to be really clear that we're looking at them and we're assessing them both at an individual and in a collective context, because both cases are going to serve to either build or enhance trust or break trust.
Right.
The next one we're going to move to is openness. Openness, again, I think another word that we often use synonymous with openness is transparency. Are we engaging in open communication? Are we talking? Are we listening? Are we being candid? I think a term that we often use in mediation is, are we engaging in good faith? Are we sharing sufficient information? Are we sharing decision making? Are we helping people understand why we're doing what we're doing? Are we sharing power? And so openness really is this, and I think openness comes back to the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to, I think for many, the ability to say, I'm not sure I know. The ability to be open with the complexity of the situations we're dealing with. I think that are people, am I a system that is open for others to engage, to inquire, to ask questions of, or am I a system or an individual which does not invite engagement? And I think, particularly working in education, we can look at this clearly between the system and families we work with. This is equally an issue within system among professionals as we're working together.
Mindfulness, out of all of the attributes, I think it's one of the neatest ones and one of the hardest ones. Mindfulness is really about individual self-awareness and self-reflection. And we could spend a lot of time on this. Really, what self-awareness and self-reflection is about is, am I aware of who I am as I engage this challenge and conflict? Am I aware of my impact versus the intent of what I'm saying? We talked about transparency before and openness. Some of these overlap, but being transparent in who you are. And the other part of that is that self-awareness and self-reflection comes out too in my own alignment to my values. Are the words that I'm speaking and the actions that I'm taking aligned to the values that I say are important, or to the organization I represent? And am I aware of that? And once I'm aware of that, what am I willing to do about that? And then the other part of mindfulness is, I think oftentimes we forget this in times of challenge or conflict, is that we always have choice. And oftentimes people feel backed into a corner, or that they don't have a choice, but there is always, always a choice as to how to respond to what's being presented to us. However ugly, however difficult, however challenging, we have a choice as to how we will come forth and respond to that challenge that's presented to us. And oftentimes taking the high road is a choice that we don't see when we feel like we just are being attacked and we need to react.
I would add that mindfulness is probably, of the list of 6, is the one that's been added to the list most recently, and it really has come from our awareness that our ability to assess our own trustworthiness, to the extent that we are engaging as trustworthy individuals, to the extent that we are engaging in ways that are manifesting what we consider these critical attributes, is built on our ability to be mindful. And again, I think what's also important about the notion of mindfulness is self-awareness without judgment. So being aware that, you know, I'm not being very open. I can beat myself up about that. I say, I'm not being very open. What do I need to do to adjust that to move forward? I think mindfulness also, again, interrelates with, for what many of us would recognize, is just a whole area of emotional intelligence that's required in order to really be self-aware as it relates to these areas. Because when we're talking about trust and being trustworthy, we're really talking about not just what we're doing, but who are we being, who are we committed to being. And much of our work has gone back and forth between assessing who we're committed to being and then what are we doing that aligns with that commitment of being, and where does it keep us at integrity or in alignment with our commitment to be trustworthy. And so mindfulness just had to come onto the list because it's this essential attribute of being aware in service of this commitment to being trustworthy. Reliability, a big one, I think, in many ways. You could almost say, Don, this one, I trust you because you're reliable. You show up when you're going to show up. You produce what you're going to produce, do what you're going to do. You demonstrate your commitments. You're dedicated to the relationship and the work that we're doing. There's a sense of diligence there. It really is, as I trust you because what's the classic sort of trust exercise is trust fall. I'm going to fall off backwards because we're going to rely on the fact that you're going to be there to catch me. And so I think reliability really has to do with this ability, this willingness to be who you say you're going to be, do what you say you're going to do in the ways in which you're going to do it. And in fact, if for some reason you're not going to be able to follow through on your commitment, you're reliable to tell me that you're not. Right. To be open and honest about that, and for us to continue to work through that process.
Right. So again, each of these attributes are attributes for a mediator to pay attention to in themselves, but also entry points for a mediator to look at the various parties where they may have a struggle with that attribute or not demonstrating it. That would be an entry point for a mediator to work with that party, to build capacity in the party, so that once you have reliability, once you have mindfulness and openness, then you can begin to recreate the narrative and know that there'll be follow through on it. So. The last attribute we want to talk about is competence, and this one is critically important too. You know, you can be competence is about having the skills and the knowledge to perform the task at hand, but it's also about being flexible enough when the task changes or when the context changes to change with the context and the task. Competence is important in terms of trustworthiness because I would then, if you're competent, I can believe in your ability and your willingness to fulfill your responsibilities or expectations or obligations effectively. If I don't have a belief that you're capable and competent of doing something that you've just agreed to do, then there's going to be an erosion of trust. And so then in terms of mediation or even in terms of the work that you do or interactions you have with others, if you don't believe that another has the ability and the willingness to respond effectively, then we have to change the expectation. So often what happens, again, and it erodes trust at a devastating rate. We make commitments, we make goals, we say we're going to do this, this, and this, and it doesn't happen. And so you have people with expectations of someone's behavior, and that expectation will never be fulfilled because the person doesn't have or the entity doesn't have the capacity or the ability or the willingness
Of all the attributes, this is one that I find actually quite fascinating, because I think it really takes a dimension of trust and it moves it away from this idea of personal integrity. You can be a totally trustworthy person. I'm not questioning your trustworthiness. I'm not questioning some core attribute of who you are. I'm questioning that you have the knowledge to do what you say you're going to do. And I think that's a fundamentally different thing. And I think in the context of special education, particularly when we're dealing with kids with complex needs, you know, a parent may say, I don't trust the system. We may take that as a personal attack. Well, you're questioning my integrity. No, I'm questioning your ability to meet the needs of my child, or that you are up to speed with current practice, best practice around this. And I think in many ways it depersonalizes the question that you're not questioning me, you're questioning my abilities or my knowledge or expertise around a specific issue. And I find that it's just interesting that in a lot of cases I mediate both in a workplace context. When you really unpack it, the trust has become, particularly around, I see between employers and leaders, this leader's a great person, this leader's got great integrity. The leader does not know how to be a leader. So it's a lack of leadership competence as opposed to trustworthiness. But I don't trust you. I don't trust that you have the ability to lead this organization well.
Right. Again, this all gets back to expectations and obligations.
Also gets back to context.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've got this quote up here: real change begins with the simple act of people talking about what they really care about, from Margaret Wheatley. And we're going to really shift, I think, our conversation a bit really now to what we do as mediators and conflict engagement professionals, is that we facilitate conversations. Now, our hope is that what we've done so far in this presentation is to give you language in which to enrich the conversations that you have about trust. So we're not necessarily just talking about trust as the singular, ill-defined construct. We're talking about trust that we can actually unpack, and we can actually assess, you know, where is there trust, where is there not trust. We can also look at, well, what's the evidence that trust exists or doesn't exist? And that evidence is in many ways evidence through those particular attributes. So now what? Deconstructing a story. I'm going to make an assumption that many of you are familiar with as mediators, for those of you who are engaged in that context of a narrative approach to mediation. And I find that, you know, trust, in the context of trust, really the narrative approach is a very useful model for which to engage the conversation. You know, Kathy used the concept earlier that when trust becomes broken, the narrative becomes, you're an untrustworthy person. This is a relationship where trust does not exist. And I think that we, more often than not, 95% of the time at least, are getting called because people find themselves in a stuck conflict story. And the stuck story is, we don't trust each other. And that defines our relationship. Can you help us in that context, okay? So in many ways, the role of a narrative approach to the conversation is really a couple ways we can look at this. One, we can look at it in a responsive, in a reactive way, okay? And we can recognize that we or the parties find themselves in a narrative that is defined by lack of trust, and that we need to create a conversation that allows them to, in essence, deconstruct that broken trust narrative and reconstruct a narrative of trust. An example I did, this is not a special example, but this would be an example of a school district where the union and the district were getting ready to bargain their contract. Came and said, you know, we're going to bargain our contract. The only thing that we agree on right now is that if we bargain at this point in time, we're going to be on strike. And so when we got into the conversation, realized that they were stuck in a conversation or stuck in a story that said there is no trust between union and management. It does not exist. And we explored and unpacked where that story come from. And I sort of had to laugh. I said, where did you get that story? And they said, we wrote it the last 2 times we bargained. And in that sense is that the last 2 times they bargained their conflict and engaged, they had eroded and used all social capital by engaging in untrustworthy ways and taking what had been a very trustworthy narrative and moving into a narrative of no trust. And so in that context, we really began using a narrative approach and begin to externalize the problem. And the problem is not management, the problem is not the association or the union, the problem is we are in a context where we lack trust and respect for each other. And we could name that. We could also assess the cost of that particular story. The cost of that story that they all agreed on is we're going to be on strike, and they could look at that, okay? We could look at the effects of the problem and look at what is this current dynamic, this current story making not possible. What's not making it possible for us to go forward and engage the issues that we need to engage as a union bargaining team, and to make a choice. And the choice they made clearly was to deconstruct this conflict story and reconstruct the reconciliation stories. And I'm going to look at questions we used for framing that, but maybe begin moving towards a resolution story. So one way of approaching the whole narrative of trust or lack of trust is, I think as conflict engagement professionals, we're often asked to step into a story where there is a broken, trust has been broken, people don't know what to do with that, they don't have language with which to engage it, and as the title of our seminar says, or what we sometimes say, how do I talk to you about trust when I'm not sure I trust you enough to talk to you about the fact that I don't trust you, okay? So engaging it, another way of building trust is in a proactive way. I spend a lot of time working with teams who are forming for the first time and who are saying, you know, we want to build trust and a trusting relationship. We're forming together as an organization, and we want to go into that building trust. And so the conversation becomes, okay, we're not having a conversation about the fact that trust is inappropriate. We're talking about a conversation where you want to engage in trust, with trust, and you're not sure what that looks like. You have differential expectations and assumptions about that, what that looks like. So we're going to have a conversation where we're going to unpack those assumptions and those expectations and create a set of shared expectations that will allow you to create a structure for moving forward to do so. Can I comment at this point? Okay. So I've added some questions that often, I think, the conversations that we have are often driven by the questions we ask. And so I'm just going to look at some questions that I know I've used in many ways to facilitate this conversation. As you consider the different types of trust, what types of trust are evident in this relationship? This is something that Kathy's actually done with her work around the trust typology, is to actually go into a group or organization and map trust. Where does trust exist? Where is trust showing up in strength, and where is trust showing up as a weakness? Assessing the attributes. So people begin to have a sense of, well, we have trust here, but we don't have trust there. And so we actually look at a map for doing that. As you consider the different types of trust, where are you experiencing a breakdown in trust? Is it an institutional trust issue? Is it an unwillingness to give or grant trust?
Or fiduciary trust issue.
Yeah.
The other part of the typology and the attributes is that it now gives people a common language to talk about it, as opposed to just saying there is no trust and it's a nebulous sort of concept. Now there is a language to have that conversation and to recreate the new narrative based on, here's where we're really strong, here's where we need to get stronger. And they can be specific down to actionable items for that specific group or individual.
What is the cost of the current situation? What is not possible? And again, that's really inviting people to make a judgment about what is, and invite them to recognize that you have a choice. You can be at the effect of what is, or you can be a cause to create something different. And again, for us as mediators, we're not therapists. We're saying you have a situation where you're not experiencing trust. Can we facilitate a conversation that would begin moving you into a shared understanding of what trust is and how it's going to be manifested in that relationship? Describe a time when you experienced trust in this context. What changed? One of the things I found interesting with this union contract issue was that both sides had worked together in that district for 25 years. They had deep relationship connections with each other. They could also talk about this fact, and they used this language. We used to be a family. We used to be a family. And so really actually bringing into their conversation, their story about trust, those times in their past where they had collectively and individually across relationships experienced trust with each other. Went the wrong way, sorry about that. When you envision a relationship in which trust is evident, what would you assume would be different? How would trust be manifesting itself? And this is again where we begin looking at what are the attributes that would show up? And how do we take those attributes that are somewhat generic, benevolence and caring, and say, but what would that really look like? I think, how do we as mediators move from from a general concept where we'd be caring about each other? Well, let's dive deeper. What would that look like? What would be present now that's not present? And I think that part of our job as mediators and facilitators of these conversations is how do we take this construct and operationalize it for our situation and our context, such that we can assess the presence and or the absence of that attribute so that we can continue to build it. What attributes of trust might you develop so as to rebuild trust and social capital? So in contexts where trust has been broken, what do we need to do to, where are we going to focus our energy to create steps that would move us towards building trust? Trust does not go from 0 to 60 in one step. Trust is often broken quickly. Trust is rebuilt over time. And so how do we make, using baby steps ideas to begin rebuilding trust? What will we commit to doing? How will we commit to being in the relationship to move forward? How are we going to hold ourselves accountable to those commitments?
So oftentimes when we talk about the attributes and we are digging deep into them with a group of folks, they usually come out in a negative form. What is not there, what they don't like. And it's often difficult, but the way you want to do that is to frame the attribute in a positive. So if this is what you're feeling now, what would that look like if that were not the case? And moving people in a direction of articulating a positive behavior to replace, if you will, the negative attribute.
I think I'm going to go back to something I've used this term before. I think one of our roles as conflict engagement specialists or mediators in this context is to push for specificity. Yeah. What are people committed to doing? What are institutions committed to doing? How are we going to know what that commitment looks like? The who, what, when, where, and how. How are we going to assess that? What are we going to do? And we often ask these questions. What are we going to do if for some reason we're unable to follow through and commit to meet our commitment? What are we going to do? So again, a way of, again, looking at the role of the mediator in that context.
Be specific and concrete. Whatever you come up with, you have to be able to hold each other accountable to, but everyone has to be able to see it when it happens and see when it doesn't happen.
So we're going to wrap up here. A couple of quotes. You want to go with that one?
Yeah. So being honest and walking with integrity means that we confront the challenges before us. So over the course of many years, come to find out, working in the areas that we do, that most people look at confrontation as a negative thing. Confrontation doesn't have to be adversarial. It just means that we're going to face this issue together, and instead of putting our heads in the sand and ignoring it, we're going to attack it together. So when we have a challenge, looking at that challenge or that conflict as you and I against that challenge, as opposed to you and I against each other. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the quote before, conflict is like fire, it can burn and can give light. And so conflict, confrontation, you have a choice. You can let it destroy, you can let it burn things down, or you can use the light and the warmth to create new narrative, new relationship, and build on it. And so we just really want to try to move from this adversarial notion to a more productive outcomes.
And in that light, what is our role as mediators? Our role as mediators is to create a safe space for that conversation. Years ago, I asked one of my first mediation instructors, what are the key attributes or characteristics of a good mediator? And he shared optimism and perseverance. I think people often engage a broken trust with a level of pessimism. It's broken, trust is broken, therefore the relationship is broken, therefore there's really no possibilities for moving forward. And in this presentation, our hope is that you have language to say, well, let's not go there too quickly. I have a belief and hope that we can engage this conversation jointly and to create a context where there can be a safe engagement of that particular conversation. The next quote I want to put out there is probably one of my favorite quotes. This comes from an article called Relationships in the Schoolhouse by Roland Barthes, came out of Ed Leadership in 2006. And I think that what's important here is that we often look at this and say, okay, well, what does this have to do with students and student learning? I mean, really, I mean, we're talking about education. And when I read this quote, it just did my heart good, I think I would say in many ways. He starts his article, he says, one incontrovertible finding emerges from my career spent working in and around schools. The nature of relationships among the adults within a system, which includes teachers, administrators, and parents, has a greater influence on the character and quality of that school, and I added the bold here, and on the student accomplishment than anything else. And again, we know this, and we've experienced this, but when trust becomes broken among the adults within a system, our ability to have the conversations that we need to have in service of our primary function, the needs of children, is compromised. You know, and trust is an issue that is gone unaddressed, will compromise our ability to be effective at the work we're doing. We can have all kinds of other conversations, but if I don't trust you, and if that's an underlying dynamic of the relationship, our ability to be effective is going to be compromised. And I think that what's needed here is courage among us as mediators to invite people into this place that they may not want to go. And also invite people into a place that we may not want to go as mediators because we've got our own issues here. And yet it's an essential issue.
So we're going to end with this last quote, and I think it's indicative of sometimes a feeling of being lost when we're in challenge and in conflict. Not being lost is not a matter of getting back to where you started from. It's a decision not to be lost wherever you happen to find yourself. It's simply saying, I'm not lost, I'm right here. And I see this quote as a way of looking at challenges and conflict are an opportunity to move forth and find and create new narrative, new space, new context for a different kind of relationship. And when we're able to let go of having to be in a specific place or going back to something as opposed to being open to what is possible, the opportunities are unlimited. And so with that, I personally want to thank you for the time you've taken to be with us today, and sorry for the rush and going through some of that, and just wish you all the best. And if you're a person who happened to be in one of those hurricane areas, we wish you all the best as well too. Greg?
No, thank you for being here. This has been a fascinating and fun conversation for Kathy and I as we continue to do this work, and this opportunity to share with our colleagues is delightful. So thank you. I think we're going to go to our last slide here and actually turn it back to Anita.
We have a question. Do you actually have the conversation and talk about the elephant in the room? Trust. For example, do you say, I understand there might be some broken trust here?
So as a mediator, I would say absolutely. I think that if I just put it into a very traditional mediation agenda, if in the client's opening statements there becomes an issue that trust is a factor, then we would have the conversation. Is trust something you want to talk about? And if that's something that they want to talk about, then it goes on the agenda and we begin to engage it. And our ability to engage it has been significantly enhanced by having language with which to unpack a really complex notion. I'm just going to throw this one out there just for your own interest, because the other conversation that we found ourselves having in relationship to broken trust is a conversation around forgiveness. And we could do a whole presentation on that one also. But I have had conversations with groups in joint session about both both broken trust and two, a need for forgiveness to move forward.
A new narrative, a new resolution story to move forward together with.
Yeah, and I think that's a great, Anita, a great distinction there. We're not going to wallow in the fact that we don't have trust. We're going to acknowledge that, and the last quote I think Kathy acknowledged, we're going to acknowledge that we are currently in a place where we're not experiencing trust, and we're feeling a bit lost in there. And so, okay, in order to get lost, we need to create a shared vision of what being out of that space would look like. And so, we will spend some time looking at what's contributed maybe, or how broken trust is manifesting itself. But we're also going to lose that. You move very quickly to, okay, what would it look like if we did trust each other? What steps would we take to move forward? And I think in the context of mediation, we're very quickly saying, where we are now is with broken trust. Our goal is to move forward to create a different narrative. And I think that's where people feel safer in that conversation than spending 2 or 3 hours talking about the fact as to why we don't trust each other. So it is very much acknowledging we are in a stuck narrative. Let's acknowledge that. Let's very quickly move to having a proactive conversation to produce a different narrative.
Greg and Kathy, we have another question. Many people coming to special education mediation have lost institutional trust, and we are asking them to trust another institution, a mediation system. Do you have any suggestions on how to help these people have trust in a new institution to try the mediation process?
That's an interesting question.
Great question. Great question.
As someone who runs a mediation system.
And she does.
Yeah, so I kind of get that take. I'd love to have the face-to-face conversation. As someone who runs a mediation system, we have a strong commitment to operating a system that is trustworthy. How we will deal with confidentiality is trustworthy. Our responsiveness and that we will provide a service that we described in the way that we provided it. That our mediators are competent. I have, over 25 years, let some mediators go because they did not commit to maintaining their competence as mediators. And so I'm looking at, in many ways, and I've shared with my mediators in training, actually had Kathy come and do training for my mediators around these attributes. So as a mediator, how do I demonstrate trustworthiness as a mediator at the table? Caring and benevolence, competence, openness, integrity. So I think that all of those attributes we are committed to, I'm committed to as a provider of a service, that we will provide services that are at integrity with those attributes.
Right, and so I think the key part of this is not just saying that you have an organization that does that, but demonstrating those actions. So that if you have parties who are not trusting of the institutions, and in many cases there are reasons to not be, because sometimes institutions don't get the rules and regulations or the certifications or whatever right. First thing I do is I'd be clear about where that distrust comes. You can't just say I don't trust SPED, or I don't trust special education, or I don't trust that mediation group. You have to help parties get very specific about where that trust is broken. Then you go to the attributes to help that system build capacity in the attributes. So first it's identifying where the trust is broken. Specifically, even if it's institutional trust, what is it? You're not doing IEPs on time, you're not following that specific thing, or there's so much that can be broken, and so many little places where you can really just enter and fix that, or places that require a whole lot more building capacity. But you have to know where that's at first, and then you focus on those attributes.
The other piece of a systems perspective, again, for many of us who run systems, is we do evaluations. And we're evaluating, we're asking parents, school districts to evaluate, did this process meet the expectations with which you entered the process? If in some way it did not meet the expectation, I'm going to have a conversation to find out in what ways did that not meet your expectations, in what ways can we improve our system so as to better meet those expectations. And that may mean what we're doing in our intake process, what we're communicating in written form. Also, it's feedback for our mediators, and that goes then into the professional development that I do with our mediators on an annual basis. It is built off of those evaluations.
Right. And so the other thing to remember about institutional trust is, too, it's about capacity, too. Oftentimes I find that when institutional trust is broken, it's not always from malintent. It's something that fell through the cracks. It's, I'm not making an excuse, but it's overworked people or people who didn't know something, and once we bring that to their attention, sometimes it's an easy fix. Oh, didn't know that. Sometimes it's much harder, much more complicated, and much more of a task of capacity building. But again, I can't emphasize enough. First, you have to figure out what specifically is it, where was the ball dropped, and where was trust broken. Which is why we hope and believe that mapping out trust and having attributes gives people a language to focus in on that, as opposed to an emotive kind of, you're not doing this, response to what's happening.
And it sounds like you're also referring back to, if you were doing an intake process, you could be asking about expectations that hadn't been met, not necessarily naming that it's a broken trust situation, but recognizing that when expectations are not met, the result is a erosion of trust. You have another question here. Based on your experience, what indicates to you there's a trust issue from the parent side?
They tell you. I mean, in many cases, it's articulated very clearly, we don't trust the district. I mean, it often shows up in the intake process with a statement that we're not trusting the district. We're not trusting them because they're not doing what they said they were going to do on the IEP. And I'm not here to bash districts. I'm just putting that out as an indicator that that's a problem. We're not trusting the district because I've left a phone message with them 6 times and no one's returned my call. And so I would say that in many cases, I'd be interested to get a sense from my colleagues across the state, is that we are being called by a parent because they've lost trust in their ability to engage that system for multiple reasons. And that's why they are engaging us, because trust has been broken in some way. So at the risk of creating an anticipation, it's almost a given to me in that process, when that intake comes in, that there is a trust issue that's going to be there. To what extent we're going to have to engage it or not will be a question that's going to come out of the intake process.
Right, and again, getting as specific as you can with inquiry, and even having a knowledge of the attributes, framing the question. Don't say, are they not being honest, or is there no integrity? But use those in framing a question. What specifically is it that you believe they've dropped the ball on? And then you frame it in terms of an attribute.
Yeah. What is indicating to you the trust? How is broken trust manifesting itself in this context? Are questions you can ask, yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I know a lot of your language has, Greg and Kathy, y'all been talking about being mediators and mediation, and I want to kind of broaden out and say, facilitators, case managers, administrators, anybody who's having a conversation where there's indications of expectations that haven't been met, and this sort of ephemeral concept of trust can apply this language that you're giving us and questions that you've provided for us to think about where have things broken down and how can we begin to engage in a way that would rebuild working relationships, and with those good attributes of our, what did you call it, our better selves, we can begin to climb back up the trust pyramid and get together and do some good work for the benefit of kids.
Yeah, I guess the other piece I would add to that, Anita, is that we often talk about broken trust. I think that we need to look at this conversation as both a proactive and a reactive conversation. And my goal particularly for, I think as educators, we can enter into a relationship and say, let's talk about how we're going to build a relationship that is characterized by trust. What are our expectations? And I'm a firm believer in having that conversation at the front end as a proactive conversation that doesn't have to come from us as then mediators coming in and fixing trust when it's been broken. So,
great. All right. Well, we really appreciate everybody joining us today and staying with us. And as I said, the webinar is recorded, so if you want to go back and check out, refresh, if you can click on the link in the chat box and fill out a very brief survey monkey to evaluate today's webinar, we really appreciate your taking a few minutes to do this. It helps.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to share.